What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back. Thank you for joining me once again for the Pokemon Card Auctions of the Week recap. Folks, it seems like week after week, I always say after I do these recaps, you know what, next week, I'm not going to do so many auctions. That was too many auctions. Next week, I'm cutting it down. And then next week comes and it's even more auctions. I'm sorry. There's a lot that I try to cut out, but it all seems so important. So we have a great variety of auctions that came by throughout the entire TCG. I thank you so much for watching today's video. And stay tuned because we are going to be drawing the winner of this Prismatic Evolutions Elite Trainer Box right after today's sponsor. And today's amazing auction recap sponsor is the great people over at KantoShark.com. The Kanto Shark marketplace is currently filled with insane graded Pokemon card grails, both vintage and modern, also high-end sealed booster boxes, graded booster packs, even Yu-Gi-Oh! And One Piece cards. And with some of the record sales they've had this past month, it really wouldn't be a bad idea to consider consigning your cards in their ever-expanding marketplace, folks. As always, a link to the Kanto Shark website will be in the description of this video. Please support the channel, go check them out, and let me know what you pick out. Alright folks, it's time to draw the winner of this Prismatic Evolutions ETB. Let's get started. Now if you recall, a couple of videos ago I did a market-changing sales video where I asked you to go to KantoShark.com, pick out your favorite thing listed, and comment underneath that video. So if you did that, you were in the drawing for this ETB. Alright, so let's pick a comment here. First we're going to copy the URL, and then we are going to go to the CommentShark.com random comment picker. Paste the URL right there, and we are going to exclude replies, and we're only going to include one winner, that it can be only one. So let's pick a random YouTube comment. And Kalo, what's your last name, said, oh my goodness, the PSA 10 Lugia EX from Unseen Forces. An excellent pick, if I do say so myself. So congratulations. Please reach out to me via Instagram or my email if you don't have Instagram. All right, folks, let's get into this week's auction recap, starting off with some of the graded cards from the White Flare Black Bolt sets that just came out. Here we have a SIR Zekrom EX in PSA 10, sold for an even $1,000. Here we have the all-black Zekrom EX in PSA 10 that sold for $1,626, while the all-white Reshiram EX sold as a PSA 10 for $1,823. Here, folks, is a collection that's all framed. It's all PSA 10s of the 151 and Pokemon TCG Classic starters. So even includes the special illustration rare Charizard EX in PSA 10. All these cards sold for a total of $2,450 this week. Here we saw a couple of bangers from Steam Siege, mainly Gardevoirs. Actually, it's only Gardevoirs. Here's a Mega Gardevoir EX. We saw two sales of this card, one for $860, the other one for $880. And then we saw the Secret Rare Gardevoir EX, one that sold for $810, the other one for $1,135 this week. Several more cards from the XY era. Here's a beautiful Mega Alakazam EX from Fates Collide, sold for $1,073. We saw numerous insane sales from Ancient Origins, mainly those Primal cards. Here's a Kyurem EX in PSA 10, sold for $680. Here's that Primal Kyogre EX, sold for an even $5,000. And then we saw two sales of the Primal Groudon EX, one for $5,600, the other one for $5,650. And then we saw two sales of the Mega Rayquaza EX, one for $7,600, the other one for $8,150. So man, Ancient Origins has completely blown up. Just wait till later on in this video, folks. We saw a case of Ancient Origin booster boxes sell that might blow your mind with the price they went for. Here's the Full Art Charizard EX from Flashfire, sold for $4,500. Here is an XY promo Shaman EX in PSA 10 that's sold for $3,850. And then here we have a lot of XY promos of Charizard, Blastoise, Venusaur, Pikachu, Mewtwo, and Mew. All raw copies sold for $1,502. Just a couple of black labels. Here's a Pikachu Stamp Box promo card that got the black label and sold for $6,200 this week. And then I didn't cover this last week. This is a sale from like 2 weeks ago. It is this black label Misty's Favor from Unified Minds that sold for 7,433 big ones. And then I'm not sure if you caught my most recent video, because this guy was on it. It's the Armored Mewtwo in PSA 10, sold for $6,571. And then getting into some vintage cards on eBay, we have this Ancient Mew. And may I say that the label on there is maybe more ancient than the Ancient Mew itself. Sold as a PSA 10 for $1,625. Here is a Japanese base set Charizard in PSA 10, sold for $5,908. And folks, I'm pretty excited about this. I'm not sure about you, but I'm pretty excited. We are seeing a black label copy of this card come through an auction, selling this weekend, so I will cover it on next week's auction recap. I have never before seen a black label base set Charizard come by an auction, so I'm very excited to see the results of that. Here we have a PSA 10 base set Shadowless Alakazam, sold for $5,100. Here is a Dutch first edition Venusaur from base set, sold as a PSA 10 for $2,075. Here we have the Unlimited Vaporeon Holo from Jungle, the same one you get from those Water Blast theme decks, sold for $3,500. And also from Jungle was this first edition Cubone that sold as a PSA 10 for $336. You might be asking yourself, why are you covering a Cubone on the auction recaps? Because it's a Cubone. It's a common card from Jungle and it's still selling for $336. Is anyone else amazed by that? Or is it just me? I don't know. I thought that was very interesting. Here we have an Unlimited Dark Raichu from Team Rocket set, sold for $2,627, along with this first edition Dark Dragonite that came by again and sold for $5,225. Here is a magnificent Blaine's Moltres from Gym Heroes, first edition PSA 10, sold for $4,200, along with this Rockets Mewtwo first edition holo from Gym Challenge that sold for $3,650 this week. Up next, we have a couple of cards from the Neo series. Here's the first edition Ho-Oh from Neo Revelation, sold for an even $4,000. And then here is a black label holo Espeon from the Japanese Neo Discovery set that sold for $11,100. And also from Neo Discovery was the English first edition Yanma, a very low pop card, might be the lowest pop holo from Neo Discovery. It always used to be anyway. Sold as a PSA 10 for $8,500 this week. From Neo Destiny, we saw this first edition Dark Gengar in PSA 9, sold for $2,500, while the PSA 10 sold for $6,855. Here we have the Unlimited Shining Gyarados in PSA 10, sold for $9,200 this week, along with the first edition Shining Charizard, got a PSA 10 and sold for $19,100. Here we have that gorgeous Mewtwo from Expedition, sold for $6,849. Here's a Pichu holo from Expedition, sold for $3,826. And then we saw a PSA 9 Crystal Charizard that sold for $11,600. And may I remind you that this was the price that a PSA 10 was selling for many years. Up next, we have a couple of old school EX cards. From Dragon, we saw this Latios EX sell for $3,325. The Rayquaza EX sold for $4,752. From Fire Red Leaf Green, we saw this Blastoise EX sell for $3,300. And then this Raichu EX saw two sales this week as a PSA 10, one for $1,725, the other one for $1,575. And is this not the worst rendition of Raichu you have ever seen? Oh my gosh, I can't even stand to look at it, folks. I'm sorry, but to all you Raichu fans, this card did Raichu dirty. It's just awful. I'll leave it at that. Here's a reverse holo Lugia from Unseen Forces that sold for $2,901. And then, folks, the gold stars are just out of control. Every week I say it, but it becomes more and more true as the weeks go by. The gold stars are out of control. Check out some of these sales. Here's the Gold Star Jolteon from EX Power Keepers, sold for $11,700. Here's a Gold Star Vaporeon, sold for $12,200. The Gold Star Groudon sold for $13,401. Here is a CGC10 Gem Mint Gold Star Mudkip from EX Team Rocket Returns, sold for $14,900, along with this PSA 10 Trico Gold Star that sold for $17,600. Here is a Gold Star Espeon. Got a PSA 9 and sold for $11,100, folks. And then we saw the PSA 10 copy of this card sell for a whopping $32,600. My wallet's sweating just looking at these prices. And then here we have a Gold Star Rayquaza. This is a raw copy. If you take a look at the front and back of this card, it is not in the best of shape, but still sold for $5,600 for a shabby looking raw copy of this Gold Star Rayquaza. And then lastly, for the Gold Stars, we saw this BGS 8.5 Gold Star Rayquaza sell for $17,900. Up next, we have a couple of PSA 10s from Diamond and Pearl Secret Wonders. Here's a Holo Entei, sold for $2,125. And then we saw this Cosmos Holo Raikou that sold for $2,101. We saw even more PSA 10 level X cards come by this week. Here is an Absol level X from Supreme Victors, sold for $5,150. And then we saw two PSA 10 Lucario level X cards from Mysterious Treasures come by, and they both sold for $5,200 a piece. Here is a Raichu level X from Stormfront that also sold for $5,200. Here is a Cresselia level X from Great Encounters that sold for $3,061 this week. And then here, folks, is a little binder lot of 100 vintage cards. As you can see, some bangers on the front page there. A Blaine's Charizard, a Gengar level X, a reverse holo Charizard from Expedition. Sold for a total of $2,025. So there's a lot of good stuff in this binder, but man, not in the best shape. Take a look at the back of this card. It is bent up on the side there. I'm not sure what's going on in the corner up there. If you take a look at this Lugia Legend card, it looks like a cat was dancing on it. It's so scratched up. So yeah, even pretty damaged cards still go for over $2,000 is kind of insane. Up next, we have several PSA 10s from Call of Legends. Call of Legends, in my opinion, one of the top 10 greatest sets of all time. Here's a Holo Entei that sold for $4,050. The Palkia sold for $5,680. The Raikou sold for $6,180. The Groudon sold for $9,600. And then the Ho-Oh sold for $9,750. And then here we have a pre-release staff Snorlax from Call of Legends. This sold as a PSA 10 for $4,551. And I really like what's going on with the illustration of this card. It's like summoning a energy sphere above it. I'm not sure if it's like sleeping while doing it, but it's pretty awesome. And then lastly, for our graded cards on eBay, we saw a couple of graded cards from the black and white era that we're not used to seeing. It wasn't until the White Flare Black Bolt sets came out. Now we're kind of seeing these cards come out of the woodwork. Here's a full art Reshiram from Black and White base set that sold for $2,600. Here's a regular Groudon EX from Dark Explorers that sold as a PSA 10 for $420. Here's a full art Giratina EX from Dragons Exalted, sold for $1,515. A full art Kyurem EX from Next Destinies sold for $2,700. Here's a full art Thundurus EX from the worst set of all time, Emerging Powers, sold as a PSA 10 for $510. And then from Legendary Treasures, we saw this full art gold Reshiram, sold as a PSA 10 for $4,400. And then let's not forget this 2009 Rumble Pikachu card that sold as a PSA 10 for $9,950. A couple of interesting pieces of sealed product came by. Here is an Elite Trainer box of Cosmic Eclipse that sold for $1,375. Here is an ETB of Unified Minds that sold for $781. An Elite Trainer box of Team Up sold for $2,225. Shining Legends sold for $661. And then we saw this Sun and Moon Burning Shadows booster box sell for $1,125. A Steam Siege box sold for $1,200. And then here, folks, we have this Diamond and Pearl Secret Wonders booster box sold for $13,600. Here's a Black and White Dragons Exalted booster box that sold for $13,899. While this Platinum Supreme Victors booster box sold for $16,101. And then we saw a Team Up booster box sell for $9,752. Very, very close to a 5-figure booster box. And then here we have that case of Ancient Origins booster boxes. Folks, this guy sold for $32,909 this week. Woo, and then I'm going to finish off this recap with just a couple of cards from Fanatics Collect Weekly Auction Block. Here is a no symbol Snorlax holo from Jungle. Got the CGC 10 pristine grade, sold for $4,320. Here we have an Umbreon reverse holo from Diamond and Pearl Majestic Dawn, sold as a PSA 10 for $4,080. Here's a first edition Smeargle from Neo Discovery. Very low pop card, sold for $5,040, along with this first edition Heracross from Neo Genesis that also sold for $5,040. From Black and White Legendary Treasures, here is the Full Art Gold Zekrom, sold for $5,760. Here is a Mew from EX Legend Maker, sold as a PSA 10 for $5,880. Here's a PSA 10 first edition Dark Blastoise from Team Rocket, sold for an even $6K. Here is a CGC 10 Gem Mint Gengar holo from Skyridge, sold for $6,900, while this first edition Fossil Gengar in PSA 10 sold for $7,200. Here is a Gold Star Pikachu in PSA 9, sold for $9,900. And then we saw this Japanese Shining Gyarados in PSA 10, sold for $8,700. While this first edition Shining Mewtwo from Neo Destiny sold for $10,500, along with the Japanese version of this card that also sold for $10,500. Here we have a CGC 10 Gem Mint Reverse Holo Charizard from Legendary Collection, sold for $11,100. Here's a CGC 10 Pristine Rocket Snorlax EX that sold for $13,200. And then we're going to finish off with a couple of Poncho Pikachus. Here is the PSA 10 Magikarp and Gyarados Poncho wearing Pikachu, sold for $16,200. And then we saw these BGS 10 copies of the Rayquaza Poncho wearing Pikachus, sold for $17,400. That's it, folks. Holy crap, that was a lot of auctions. I always try to cut it down for you. This week I didn't do a very good job, so I hope you stay tuned to the very end. I really appreciate it. That's all I got for you today, folks. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will catch you in my next one.